Hello, everyone, and welcome and for joining the Canada-China Friendship Forum. My name is Ian Watts. I am the Outreach Coordinator for the China Solidarity Committee, and I'll be the moderator for this forum today. We'll start off with a land acknowledgement. This forum is being hosted in Edmonton, which is located within Treaty 6 territory, and we'd like to recognize that the history and discussion of racism, settlement, and development of Canada takes place in the context of Canada's relationship with its Indigenous and First Nations people. For our opening remarks, we'll have Madame Lu Shu, Consul General of the People's Republic of China in Calgary, deliver some opening remarks. Thank you.
I hear a lot of background voices. So shall we start?
I'll just mute the other people. You can start.
Thank you. Okay, friends, comrades, good evening. And salute to our keynote speaker, Mr. William Dere, and a salute to our friends coming from Ukrainian Society Association. So it is my great pleasure to be invited by the host to kick off the forum today. It is a very courageous and encouraging move to choose anti-racial discrimination as the theme of today's Canada-China Friendship Forum. By focusing on discussions and proposed solutions around this topic, the forum is designed to increase the public awareness of human rights violation among the certain communities, as well as illustrate that the human conscience will not be wiped out despite thousands of years of ups and downs. Looking back into the history, the racial discrimination has never ever gone away. Since the 19th century, when the Chinese immigrants came to this country to build the Pacific Railway, unequal treatment has fallen onto them without at least being questioned. Although burdened with the toughest jobs and made huge sacrifices in building the railway, the Chinese immigrants were treated as slaves, and their contributions were completely ignored and forgotten for a long time afterwards. In 1885, Canada passed the Chinese Immigration Act, which was obviously discriminatory against the Chinese immigrants. Since then, more than 80,000 Chinese immigrants had been levied about 23 million Canadian dollars in poll tax, an amount comparable to the whole cost of constructing the Pacific Railway. In 1923, Canada replaced the poll tax with the Chinese Exclusion Act, separating the Chinese immigrants from their families on the two sides of the Pacific Ocean. In 1985, the Canadian government built a monument to commemorate the centennial completion of the Pacific Railway, but the contributions of the Chinese immigrants were not at all mentioned in the inscription. The systematic racial discrimination has hardly been a secret in Canada. However, history has always repeated different but essentially the same stories at different stages. In June last year, the Angus Reid Institute released a polling survey over a certain number of Canadian Chinese. 58% of the respondents said they had experienced discrimination within the past year, while 28% said discrimination occurred always or often. The systematic racial discrimination against the Chinese community in Canada has been stirred up again in recent years, which is the result of the interaction of multiple factors. The discrimination in the early days caused by disdain is evolving towards hostility and hatred. The disputes between China and Canada over Meng Wanzhou case and outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic have become an excuse and an outlet to carry the discrimination against the Chinese community. Furthermore, some Canadian politicians insist on the political correctness of striking at anything Chinese out of their own political interests, leading the Canadian public opinion on China to the wrong direction. The mainstream media in the United States and most of the Western countries play a role of fanning the flames and adding fuel to the fire by fabricating and spreading fake news related to China, leading to the intensified discrimination and hatred against the local Chinese community. What deserves vigilance is that while the US and the Western politicians and media are attacking China in an all-round way, they keep on repeating, not targeting the Chinese, only targeting the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people in China or abroad, in an attempt to induce the Chinese community in the US and Canada and other Western countries into a false illusion of safety and a surrender of all claims to fairness and justice. In the face of discrimination, there is only one way out for the Chinese community here. That is to get united, motivated, organized with concerted efforts to fight for their own civil rights by firmly opposing and strongly condemning all hypocrisy, slander, and racial discriminatory words or actions. Only then can the attention of the Canadians be aroused to the issue of discrimination against the Canadian Chinese. Can governments at all levels in Canada no longer turn a blind eye to the issue of discrimination against the Canadian Chinese? And can the rights of survival and the development of the Chinese community be finally and truly secured? Once again, thank you very much for having me here. I wish the forum a great success and the discussions fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you for the opening remarks. I will now introduce the featured speaker for the forum and read a short biography. William Dere will talk about his book, Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging. William is a documentary filmmaker and author of Being Chinese in Canada, The Struggle for Identity, Redress, and Belonging, published in 2019 by Douglas and McIntyre. It was the winner of the 2020 Blue Metropolis and Council of the Arts Montreal Diversity Prize. He has been an anti-imperialist organizer and a leading activist in the two-decade movement for redress of the Chinese Head Tax and Inclusion Act. William's grandfather arrived in Canada in 1909 and paid the $500 head tax. William's father also paid the $500 head tax when he came to Canada at the age of 14 in 1921. The Chinese Exclusion Act separated William's family for over 3 decades. His film, Moving the Mountain, documents how these xenophobic legislations affected his family and the Chinese Canadian community. After William's talk, we will also have time for questions and answers afterwards. So welcome, William, and go ahead.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Madame Lu Su, for your introduction. As an immigrant settler here in Montreal, I acknowledge that we are on unceded indigenous lands of the Kanakahaka and the Anishinaabe peoples. Thank you everyone for attending this book presentation this evening, or if you're somewhere else, maybe this morning. I want to thank Helen Lee and the China Solidarity Committee for organizing this event and inviting me to speak. In this presentation, I will give an outline of my book, and I will be reading some passages from the book as well. I wrote this book because I wanted to tell my story of what it means to be Chinese in Canada. I wanted to document the head tax redress movement as well that took 22 years to win a government apology and a partial redress for the Chinese Canadian community. Reading from the book, from the introduction, this book is a voice from Chinese Canada. It is a voice from the margins and firmly plants itself in the soil of Canada and Quebec. It explores my selective memories as a Chinese Canadian activist, my motivations, and my conscious and subconscious desires to seek my true identity, culture, and place of belonging. Knowing my culture, Chinese Canadian culture, is the key to understanding and defining my identity in Canada and Quebec. It is a lifelong quest. I'm talking about a stereotype breaking in your face kind of culture, the kind of social understanding and feeling that reflects the everyday struggles and experiences of living in Chinese Canada, the kind of social understanding and feeling that establish our place and an identity in this country. The slide here is my father hitting Dere's head tax certificate when he came in 1921. I hope everybody can see the slide. I'm not too familiar with sharing the screen feature of Zoom, but it seems to be up on the screen. So this is my father's head tax certificate from 1921. I'm the son and grandson of head taxpayers. My family was separated for 3 decades by the Chinese Exclusion Act. Due to this discontinuity of family life, I knew nothing about my family history or my connections to the past until I was in my 30s. I didn't even know when my grandfather came to Canada. I only discovered that when I found a little-known artifact, the General Register of Chinese Immigration, which contained the names of the 81,000 Chinese immigrants who were forced to pay the head tax, totaling $23 million. The first part of the book explores my grandfather and father's history. I never asked them about the past, and they never spoke about it when they were still alive. But it became so important to me after they died, as I set out to search for my own identity and place of belonging. This here is my father's registration card. After the Exclusion Act was passed in 1923, all Chinese living in Canada had to register with the Department of Immigration and Colonization. Obviously, they were proud to have colonized Canada by putting it in the name of the department. So this certificate was akin to the passbook in apartheid South Africa. If you were stopped by any authorized person and you did not have this certificate on you, a Chinese person could be subjected to immediate deportation. So this certificate was quite worn, as my father probably carried it on him at all times. So my father engaged in the stereotypical occupation of a hand laundryman. Laundry work was a self-reliant business. As long as you were able to work long hours, you were able to earn a living for yourself and your family back in the village. It was called a hand laundry because everything was done by hand, from washing to ironing the clothes. My father and grandfather worked together for 30 years in East End, Montreal. From page 39 of the book. Father never thought about working outside the laundry. He knew that in the time of economic depression, there were no jobs for a Chinaman. It would be useless to compete with the low fund, that's the white people, for any kind of work. Economic exclusion went hand in hand with social exclusion. Toiling as a laundryman with his father was really the only choice for my father. They were independent workers, self-employed, resourceful, and self-reliant. The laundryman worked, ate, if not, went hungry, along with his family back in China. Life in the laundry was isolating, tedious, and mind-numbing. Grandfather and father only spoke a smattering of English and French, whatever was needed to receive and dispense the laundry. They were deaf and mute when it came to communicating with the outside world. There was very little social life due to the long hours, and there were no other Chinese in the area. The next photo here is right after my parents got married in 1925. The Exclusion Act was passed in 1923. So my mother was not able to come back to come to Canada when my father came back here. So after my parents married in 1925, my mother wanted to come to Canada with my father, but the Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1923 did not allow that. My father went back to the village 3 more times after saving enough money for the trips. He had his children during those visits, but he could not stay away from Canada for more than 2 years, or he would have lost his right to return. During this time, my mother was left back in the village to look after the children and the family home. The next slide shows, taken around 1937, shows the so-called Gold Mountain widows, all the wives, the women who were left behind, and all the children that they had to take care of on their own. This here is my mother. This is my grandmother. And here are my siblings, my 3 sisters, and my brother being held by my grandmother. My brother being held by my grandmother, yes. So my mother and siblings survived on the money that my father was able to send home, and on working the small plot of land belonging to our family. Guangdong province was in turmoil with the Japanese invasion and later the Civil War. So it was a lonely, difficult time for my mother as she had to maintain the family by herself. This is our family portrait when my father returned to the village in 1949. And that was the last time that my father went back to China in 1949. The Exclusion Act was repealed in 1947. After 3 decades in Canada without any civil rights, my father finally got his citizenship in 1950. First, he brought my brother here, and then my mother and me in 1956. This is a family portrait in front of my grandfather's laundry in East End, Montreal. Reading from the book from page 46, Dere lived his adult life in this country. Canada and the brutal racial oppression he faced, his father faced, and his family faced, shaped him. He was self-reliant, a stoic man, a Confucian man who accepted life as it came. He was mild and sometimes timid when it came to dealing with the larger hostile society. But he endured, and he derived personal strength from keeping true to himself and to his life's mission, to care for the well-being of his family. which he accomplished well. He helped others and made a difference whenever he could, and he left me a lasting value and legacy. Whatever you do in life, make a contribution. This next photo shows my mother and my father working in the laundry. This was in 1956, after my mother arrived in Canada. When my parents reunited as a couple, my mother was 50 and my father 53, that had lost their youthful years to the Chinese Exclusion Act. 3 weeks after the Canadian government apologized to the Chinese Canadian community for the 62 years of state discrimination, my mother passed away in her 101st year. She lived her first 50 years in China and her second 50 years in Canada. She was a true Chinese Canadian. From page 84 of the book, as much as I admire my father, my admiration for how my mother lived her life is more profound. She was a woman warrior, determined to succeed despite all the obstacles. She was caring with an overwhelming love. She wore her emotions on her sleeve. Her effect on me is immeasurable. I shouldn't have moved the slides. So the next passage I want to read from page 84. No, I just read that. Okay, sorry. So getting back to my text, when a CBC reporter recently asked me, "Have you ever been affected by systemic racism?" I replied, "Yeah, my whole life." From page 89 now of the book. When I was younger, I would not have been able to offer such a categorical response. Yet, as the immigrant son of a Chinese laundryman, I felt the race and class oppression of Canadian society from an early age. All the hardworking Chinese of my father's generation were aware of this mistreatment. They may not have been able to articulate this consciousness, but they fought against the way they were treated and matched wits with their oppressors through the everyday practice of resistance against authority, a form of resistance that was a natural reaction to state racism. So my father explained away the difficulty of living in Canada by saying it was because we're Chinese. This identity consciousness was his first step in formulating a strategy to survive here. In part two of the book tells how I developed my political consciousness, not identity consciousness, but political consciousness. I was a student in the 60s and 70s, and the decolonization, natural liberation struggles of the Third World and the Vietnamese resistance against U.S. aggression were inspirations for me, as well as for the burgeoning nationalist movement in Quebec. This here is a brochure of the Third World People's Anti-Imperialist Committee, of which I was a member at that time. From page 11 of the book, the decade of the 1970s was a turbulent time in Quebec and around the world. The revolutionary and popular movements of the 70s honed the Quebecois tradition of militant activism, and the province became a North American hotbed for resistance against the authority and repression of the state following the War Measures Act of 1970. Quebec activists learned how to organize within this atmosphere. I was inspired by the national liberation struggles throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America, especially the worldwide movement to oppose American aggression in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. Throughout this period, there was a beacon, a model, the People's Republic of China, led by Mao Zedong. Many progressive youth of the West were inspired by the slogans of China's great proletarian cultural revolution. The chairman exhorted the youth, "It is right to rebel." Mao's dictum, "Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend," had a quixotic air for the youth searching for solutions. So even though this was an important decade in my life, I won't go further into it because what happened here is more of a footnote than a watershed. So fast forward to the mid 1980s in part 3. I began engaging in Montreal's Chinese community. It was also an attempt to find myself, to know who I was, and in a way to connect with my father's past. The first revelation was my father's head tax certificate that I found in an almond cookie tin that my mother gave me after my father died, which contained all of his immigration papers. The history of the head tax and Chinese Exclusion Act began seeping into my consciousness and that of the Chinese Canadian community across Canada. Here was a defining issue that affected many families, as there were still many head tax payers who were still alive at that time. From page 181 of the book, here's another passage. Apart from the older generation of the Lowakyo, which means old overseas Chinese, who had lived through those exclusionary years, very few of us were aware of the true consequences of the head tax and Chinese Exclusion Act. But now the community could begin to unveil this dark history of unblemished government animosity towards Chinese immigrants. We saw the need to unravel these untold family secrets so we could come to terms with the past. One of the first to step up was Dak Liang Mark, a Chinese Canadian who, following the proclamation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, thought it was time to resolve a long-standing human rights issue that had been irking him most of his life. Dak Liang Mark had come to Canada in 1919 at the age of 11. Mark's father was a laundryman who saved to pay his son's head tax. In 1983, Mark was a retired International Woodworkers of America Union member, and so he knew his rights. He went to see his Member of Parliament, Margaret Mitchell of the NDP. I can imagine Mark saying, "Ms. Mitchell, now that Canada has entered a new era of human rights with the passing of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I think it would be time for the Canadian government to refund me the $500 my father paid as the head tax for me to get into Canada." So Margaret Mitchell saw that this was indeed an issue of fairness and equality, since no other immigrants were forced to pay this punitive tax. She fired off a letter to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who essentially ignored the issue. However, this was the beginning of a 22-year campaign to redress the head taxpayers and their families. The search for my identity was personal as well as political. I realized that this fight for equality and justice touched my family as well as many other Chinese Canadian families. I threw my heart and soul into this campaign. I was deeply motivated to seek out my family history, and I decided to make a film as part of the process of discovery. Many in the Chinese Canadian community across Canada volunteered their time and energy in the documentary Moving the Mountain became a community project as part of the Redress campaign. This next slide shows the Redress rally that we held in Ottawa in 1992. So it took us a few years to get going. We were naive in that we thought the government would do the right thing when it saw how unjust the head tax and exclusion act were. But the government has no heart. You can't appeal to its emotions. It only understands political pressure. Even a former minister of multiculturalism said to me, to get redress, you need to light a fire under the pants of government. So for 10 years, the Chrétien government had the policy of no discussion, no apology, and no redress. But we kept going, organizing small meetings, large meetings, talking to one person at a time, concerts and demonstrations, and we won many Canadians to our cause. This next photo was taken in front of the Montreal City Hall. It was Vancouver's Kim Wong who contributed so much to the Redress campaign by riding his motorcycle across Canada. And I guess it's quite obvious that this is Kim. I think it was well into his 70s when he undertook this trip across Canada. The turning point in the Redress campaign was when Chinese Canadians rose up to denounce Paul Martin's deal, which had the stipulation of no apology and no compensation. He did this deal with a small group in the community. Martin, who was famous for the sponsorship scandal, maintained his hard-headed attitude to redress, and he was soundly beaten in the 2006 elections. Stephen Harper saw an advantage to gain some votes in the Chinese Canadian community and made head tax redress an election issue by promising an apology if he got elected. So on June 22nd, 2006, 22 years after we started our campaign, the Prime Minister of Canada apologized in the House of Commons to the Chinese Canadian community for the 62 years of state racism. Reading from page 281 of the book, sitting in the parliamentary gallery, looking down at the members of parliament, reminded me of sitting in the nosebleed section of the old Montreal Forum. I had gone there once to watch hockey with my father, and I wonder what he would say now. He never came to the seat of power where punishing legislation was passed to tax him when he came to Canada, and where another cruel law was passed to keep my mother from joining him. Nevertheless, with 300 other Chinese Canadians, I was there to listen to the Prime Minister of Canada apologize to my father and my mother. So the government reluctantly gave us the minimum redress. Only the head taxpayers and surviving spouses who were alive when Stephen Harper became Prime Minister on February 6, 2006, received some compensation, which was $20,000 per surviving individual. So altogether, $15.7 million was paid to 785 surviving head taxpayers and spouses, 49 head taxpayers, and 736 widows. This was less than the $23 million face value of the head tax that was collected. So the government showed that it could profit from racism, and which it did. The 12,000 other head tax families that had no survivors received nothing. In part 4, I talk about being Chinese in Quebec. And being Chinese in Quebec is not like being Chinese in Canada. There's the minority in the minority syndrome, the rights of the Francophone minority in Canada, but the majority in Quebec take precedence over the rights of other minorities. The forces of assimilation are relentless, but we bear the burden of resistance against this assimilation. Racialized minorities also bear the burden of fighting racism. That is why we organize against systemic racism and xenophobia, like the demonstration we held against Quebec's Solidaire, a so-called progressive party here in Quebec, when one of its members called Chinese farmers predators. Here are some, oops, I think I lost, there we go. Okay, here are some photos of the demonstration we held. We walked through Chinatown. We gathered at the Chinese Family Services. We walked through Chinatown, and then we ended up to make some speeches in front of the Quebec Solidaire headquarters in Montreal. I'll read this last passage from the book, from page 180. You build a cultural identity by being aware of your place in history and by staking your claim of belonging. This is not an easy task. The dominant society tries to assimilate your mind. It denies your race, your culture, and your language. To fight back, you want the right to know your race, your culture, and your language. You want the right to be proud of your cultural heritage. This is when that self-doubt becomes self-awareness and self-affirmation. So my process of self-affirmation started when I went back to China to marry the love of my life, Dong Qing-Chen, my wife. So I will stop here on the book. However, Helen asked me to say a few words about the current anti-Asian hate and xenophobia and what it means for our community today. In my book, I show how a weak China led to a century of humiliation, not just for China, but also for the Chinese living overseas. The racist legislation of head tax and Chinese exclusion was directly linked to how the West viewed China and the Chinese as a yellow peril. The concept of the yellow peril was a powerful psychological factor to condition people to support the colonial and imperialist designs on China and to justify the opium wars waged by the British drug lords. Today, we have a strong China, and yet xenophobia is rampant among the politicians and media in Canada and the West. We moved away from the period of engagement and peaceful coexistence for mutual benefit with China starting in 2012, when the US started its policy of pivot to Asia. This policy was a determined plan to contain and isolate China by the US and their allies. So in the past decade, the constant demonization of China has had a hateful effect on the Canadian population. And I would attribute two general reasons for this anti-China hate that we're faced with today. One, China offers a multipolar world order in political, economic, diplomatic, social, and cultural relations between countries on the basis of equality, justice, and peace. This threatens the hegemonic world order of the US and its allies. The second reason is that the achievements of Chinese socialism offer an alternative to the capitalist system. So today we have a dangerous situation of the old racist yellow peril combined with the McCarthyite Red Scare to instill fear and hate. Xenophobia leads directly to anti-Asian racism. Many who engage in fighting anti-Asian racism have not been able to make the link between racism and xenophobia and the political economic basis of racism. So I would encourage anti-racist activists in our community to look at the bigger picture for the ongoing anti-Asian hate and the struggle against it. As long as the xenophobia continues in the media and among the politicians, the psychology of anti-Asian hate will continue. Seeing through the fog of racism is the first step to fighting against it. This is especially important not just for the Chinese Canadian community, but also for all progressive and peace-loving Canadians. Thank you.
All right, thank you for the presentation. So now we'll be moving on to our question and answers. Oh, you can stop sharing your screen if you want now.
Okay, I'll see how I can do that.
Yeah. So in the meantime, if people would like to ask a question, I would like them to use the raise hand feature on Zoom under the reactions menu. And that allows me to see who'd like to talk. You can also ask questions in the chat, although I might miss some of those, but I will look at it occasionally. I will ask for people to keep their questions to a reasonable length so we can have lots of people ask questions. And we'd like the questions to be respectful and to hopefully stay on topic with the speaker's presentation. So if anyone has a question, you can go ahead and raise your hand. So I see a hand raised by Alex Jackson. So you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your presentation this evening. More of a comment than a question. I just wanted to let folks know that I found your book on Libby and I'm going to start reading it. So I just want to, Libby is a e-drive service with Toronto Public Library. So if anyone is a Toronto Public Library card holder, it's on the library right now. So you should grab it.
Thank you.
Well, I guess maybe while we're talking about that is, how long did it take you to write the book? Did you have any hurdles writing it, or have any kind of clashes with any kind of racism towards developing the book?
Well, it took me about 2 years to write the book. In fact, I took my retirement to write the book. So I retired in 2014, and so the book was pretty much finished in 2016. It got accepted by 3 publishers, but I went with Douglas and McIntyre because they have a history of publishing Chinese Canadian authors, and also they did not impose any restrictions. Whereas the other 2 publishers wanted to cut down my book to, by about I guess a third, down to 100,000 words. The book is actually 140,000 words, and so I went with Douglas and McIntyre, and so it took them. You have to understand, I guess you'll discover when you try to publish a book with small Canadian publishers, is that they lack resources. And so it took about a year and a half to have it edited by the publisher. And then it sat around for a while, and it finally came out in March of 2019. But it was good that it took that time, because during the time of editing, I added some other material into the book as the circumstances here in Quebec arise, such as the well, there was supposed to have been a commission in Quebec on systemic racism when the Liberal government was in power, but then they chickened out when everybody else, all the other political parties, went after them, saying that you're trying to divide Quebec by allowing people to call Quebec people racist, which was actually not the intent. But when you appeal to narrow nationalism, I guess you can win a lot of votes, and that's where the CAQ, a right-wing party, came to power. So in terms of did I encounter any racism? Well, not more than the usual, but nothing specifically around the book.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question from Zufeng in the chat. How do the experiences and opinions of youth, both Chinese Canadian and not, impact the current scene of racism and its future?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah. So it's how do the experiences and opinions of youth impact the current scene of racism and its futures? So I guess how do the young people interact with racism?
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, young people, given their energy, I think have been very active. I know that here in Quebec, in Montreal, they've been very active. We organized a demonstration last March 21st on the day of International Day Against Racism, but also to commemorate those people who were killed in Atlanta, Georgia. There were 8 people, and 6 of them were Asian women who were murdered because they were basically Asian women, and so there was a lot of young people who mobilized and who organized that demonstration. I guess one thing that the young people need to do is just to know what the struggle is. As I mentioned in my final remarks, that looking at the big picture rather than just tagging along with the mainstream movements, that there are specificities. Can't say that word, but anyways, there's specific issues related to the Chinese community, and so we need to include those into the struggle and unite with other people on the basis of fighting against anti-Asian, anti-Chinese racism.
Okay, another question from the chat from Samantha, who says that their family experience is very similar to yours, including having to pay the head tax and experiencing the Exclusion Act. And they're asking how would they be able to perhaps search for their family's documents? So I think they would be looking for documents similar to the ones that you showed.
Okay, yes, that's a very good question. When I was doing my documentary film, I actually visited the National Archives in Ottawa, and I got out the books, the General Register of Chinese Immigration. These were about 18 inches by 15 inches. These were big books, hardcover books, and they were all handwritten, and they contained names of the 81,000 Chinese immigrants who had to pay the head tax. But today, with the modern technology, you can research the names in this general register online, and I can't remember exactly what the link is, but if you try to Google it, I suppose, General Register of Chinese Immigration, you might be able to find the link, and all you need to do, I guess, is to know the name of your relative, the exact Chinese name of the relative that was written into the general register, and then the records would come up. And if you have other information like the date that that person came to Canada, the the name, the actual name that was written in the general register, then you should be able to find the record of your ancestors who first came to Canada. I hope that answers your question.
I'd just like to remind people that they can raise their hands and ask the question themselves, but I'll read another one from the chat. So what are some anti-racist actions that low-level activists of any race can engage in to help fight this systemic capitalist racism?
That's a big question. Like I said, before you engage in fighting, it's always good to get organized, and it's always good to know your struggle, to know your battle. You have to do the research. You have to know the battle. You have to know yourself, and then you have to try and associate with like-minded people and organize yourself, because the state is very well organized, and I guess systemic racism is an organized system, and so in order to counter these things, you have to be organized. But in terms of individuals, casual everyday racism, this is something, again, you can, if you're courageous enough to confront the racists, do it if you can. But it's always good to be in numbers. So when I always say to people, when you're confronted with racism, it's always good to be with your people in order to fight that racism. So I don't know whether that's practical or not, but that's the way I would see it.
Okay, it looks like people are also asking what's the best way to support you when purchasing the book. So if there's perhaps a direct way to purchase, or something that isn't from Amazon.
Okay, I know most of us have an aversion to Amazon. You can purchase it directly, actually, from Douglas and McIntyre, the publisher. Or they would give you a list of bookstores that carry the book. Although they may not carry the book now because it's 2 years old, but they can always order it for you, and you'll get it within a week or two. But order directly from Douglas and McIntyre. That's probably the best way.
Okay, I see a question from Jonathan. Hi, William. Where do you think the head tax redressing movement is after the apology from Stephen Harper? What further actions do you think the Chinese community should take in this wake?
Oh, hi, Jonathan. Thanks for the question. Like I said, it was a partial redress because the head tax families who had grandfathers, fathers, mothers, grandmothers who passed away before Stephen Harper assumed power, before he did not get any compensation. We still have an organization in Vancouver with it being organized by a good friend of mine, Sid Tan, the Head Tax Families Association, and they're still carrying on the good fight, although it's very it's very difficult. It's been, 15 years, 16 years now since the apology. And many young people are not too aware or too familiar with the head tax and the Exclusion Act and the meanings of these two laws. So many young people today are not as passionate as I was or Sit-Dan is to carry out the ongoing redress. But what we're asking for is to redress all of those who were affected by the head tax and China's Exclusion Act, redress all the head tax families that are able to show a head tax certificate, and that they should be compensated as well. But it is an uphill struggle because time changes the demands that we had originally asked for. So it might. But if there are young people who are willing to, who have the energy, who are willing to carry on, that's great.
Okay, I actually just have a question of my own. So this summer I visited the town of Bellevue, which is a mining town in southern Alberta in the Crow's Nest Pass, and I was reading some of the historical information on some of the buildings, and I noticed that some of the buildings were talking about the Italian immigrants who came to Canada to work in the mines, and oftentimes they shared buildings with Chinese immigrants who were also named on the historical information. And I was just curious if you knew if there was similar dynamics in Montreal and other parts of Canada where the Chinese community was often in the same place as other immigrant communities.
Not really, not in Montreal, because Chinese settlement in Eastern Canada or in Montreal was relatively late. Mostly early Chinese immigrants or Chinese pioneers settled out west because it was the closest stop when you got off the ship. I visited Barkerville out in northern BC, and there used to be a big Chinese settlement there. But not necessarily here. Although here in Montreal, we had the Chinatown in Montreal, a relatively big Chinatown in Montreal at the beginning of the 20th century, and now it's dwindled and it's been decimated by gentrification by various levels of government. And so the only thing we can do now is to fight for the survival of what's left of Chinatown.
Okay, I have another question from Haixing. Oh. How do you think that Chinese immigrants should, or what should Chinese immigrants do to raise social influence under the circumstances of anti-globalization to avoid racism towards Chinese?
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the question. First of all, anti-globalization, I don't know what that really means at this time. I know 10, 15 years ago, most of us were fighting against globalization, but that was the globalization of corporations, transnationals, and so on. But today, globalization could mean multipolar relationships between countries instead of the unipolar hegemony that the U.S. is imposing on countries of the world. So I really don't know what else to say on this question.
Okay, sorry, I just need a second to read this next one. Okay, so this is a follow-up from Jonathan. So he has a second question, and it seems to me that in the face of well-organized state racism with respect to the Chinese Exclusion Act and its underlying causes, the efforts of the Chinese community are scattered and therefore not forceful enough. Where do you see the problem exists in your experience?
Yes, the Chinese Canadian community is not united, but then again, why should it be? I mean, our community is the same as reflects the entire Canadian society. So there are various classes, various political orientations, various ideologies that exist in the Chinese Canadian community. So, so having said that. So what can we do? I mean, the various factions, even during the head tax redress campaign, the movement that I was associated with, we had a big interruption of the campaign by those who came to Canada mainly from Hong Kong, because they brought with them the British tradition of Western democracy, and so they were able to put a stop of at least 6 to 8 months in the redress campaign, while they campaigned against the Chinese government in relation to the Tiananmen incident, and so the campaign was suspended by the Chinese Canadian National Council pretty much because they put their energies into taking part in the China democracy movement that was being, I guess, organized in various cities within the Chinese Canadian community. And so you can see, there's carryover of these kinds of divisions. When I first started getting involved in politics in the early 70s, the Kuomintang was still around, and they were still quite powerful. It was only after, even after Canada established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic, the Kuomintang was still there doing a rear guard, activities. So we have that. We have people who are sympathetic to People's China. There were many who went back to China to contribute to the construction of socialism in China. And then those who fled China, and their offsprings today, pretty much there was anti-communist, anti-Chinese members of the Chinese community, and so like the rest of Canadian society, we have all ideologies and all manners of politics within our community. So even within ourselves, we can't see our community as just one big, amorphous entity without any differences.
Okay, I see a hand up, but your name on Zoom is just iPhone, but go ahead and ask your question. I think you might be muted.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Oh. All right, sorry. If you can't unmute, I'll have to. You can maybe ask your question again later, but I'll move on. So I see another hand up from Yuri.
Oh, sorry.
I just unmuted him.
Oh,
okay. There we go.
Yuri, yeah.
Hi, William. I'm sorry. I just sorry. I pressed the key wrong. Sorry. I just want to change my name.
Okay, did you have a question?
Just listening. No question.
Okay. Okay.
Because I have so long time no speak English. If I ask some question, I will use Chinese. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. So another question I saw from the chat was people were curious about what historical sources you found useful when researching your book. So I guess either other books or things that you found.
Well, I collect a lot of documents, and I guess I got boxes and boxes of documentation during those 22 years of Redress campaign, and then I read a lot of books by mainly Chinese Americans, because there were very few books written by Chinese Canadians on the history of the Chinese here in Canada, although there are beginning to be some, and a lot of my research was done through interviews, oral history interviews with the old timers, the head taxpayers who were still alive at that time, because a lot of my research was already done when I was doing when I was making my documentary film back in the early 1990s, and then I just followed up with that. But one piece that was very helpful was the General Register of Chinese Immigration. I don't know if any other immigrant community has this kind of documentation. So that is a treasure trove of artifacts of research for if you're doing research on Chinese history. So the reason why that those records exist is because the government wanted to control Chinese immigration, and so that was the bad part. The good part is that these records are still there. They haven't destroyed the records, and so these records are very good if you want to do research. Just in one line, I was able to imagine the people who came to Canada, got off the boat, and ended up in detention for 2 or 3 weeks, being questioned by the immigration officer. By giving their occupation, they were actors, gave the occupation of being actors and actresses. And so you can imagine that there were all kinds of people who came to Canada in those days. And this register of Chinese immigration gave me a glimpse of what kind of people, what kind of immigrants, brave, courageous immigrants they were.
Okay, I see Sergio has a hand up.
Yes. Can you hear me, Ian?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm asking what's your take on the CPC, on the Chinese Communist Party, on what's your view on their policy? I know that you said it's multipolar. That's a little bit general. I would like to hear more your specific thoughts on it. Like, what do you think? Are some of the effects of having multipolar world versus some sort of like versus what we have today, basically. Just kind of like a one country type of rule, or a small bloc, as opposed to China that wants to basically join with other sort of like countries to implement a different view. As you said, it's multipolar, but if you can expand on that, what are your thoughts on it? A specific effects that could have, or the impacts, maybe in Canada, for example? I know that's your most specific sort of case, but you can expand on it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for the question. The concept of a multipolar world is nothing new. It started with the non-alignment movement, the Bandung conference. I think it was 1956, if I'm not mistaken, where the countries of the third world came together to fight against colonialism and imperialism. I guess if you want to look at the world and how it is divided, and you hear this in the news today, that the world is against Russia, the international community is against Russia. But if you look at that, you can see whose international community this is, and it's the American, the Canadian, the European Union, maybe Australia and New Zealand. That's pretty much it. Oh yeah, don't forget Japan. That's pretty much it. And so the multipolar world are the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, which comprises the overwhelming population of the world. I don't have the exact numbers, but you can imagine that this is the overwhelming majority of people of the world. So, what China is saying is nothing new. Like I said, it's always been their position that all countries should be treated equally, no matter what size and what political or economic power they have, that they should be treated equally. And the multipolar concept of equality, justice, and peace should apply to all countries in the world, and not to have a one hegemonic power like the United States. And I think maybe some of us might agree that the United States probably creates a lot more problems than they solve. And that is due to their concept of hegemony and their concept of unipolarity, and that the universe revolves around the United States, whereas China says no. Nothing revolves around China as such, or although given their economic clout, they might have some influence, but officially and philosophically, nothing revolves around China. China is just one of the countries in the multipolar world. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so I think we've gone past 30 minutes. So unfortunately I don't know if we're going to be able to get to any more questions. So I guess we'll stop there. Now we'll have Dr. Helen Lee, chair of the China Solidarity Committee, give some closing remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and comrades.
Oh, sorry, you're muted, Helen.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, that's better.
Ladies and gentlemen and comrades, first of all, thank you very much for attending the second Canada-China Forum organized by the China Solidarity Committee. And thank you very much, Madam, for your remarkable remarks. I would also like to extend my appreciation to Mr. William Dere for bringing the grievances of the Chinese community to the general public. Being Chinese in Canada is certainly not easy. it is at best full of severe hardship and at worst extremely traumatic and dangerous, especially under the current xenophobic atmosphere. Chinese Canadians, like all other immigrants, arrived in Canada for a better life. However, what we encounter is a gigantic mountain of misery, injustice, and discrimination. In order to lure immigrants in as cheap labor, the Canadian establishment bears no in painting a rosy picture of Canada, which has nothing to do with reality. Even African American slaves who escaped slavery via the Underground Railroad found the living conditions here dire. As a result, the disillusioned former slaves called Nova Scotia Nova scarcity. As Canadians, we cannot deny this fact that systematic racism is a very dark chapter in the history of our nation. Chinese are not the only victims. Throughout Canadian history, different ethnic groups were singled out for unfavorable treatment, harassment, and persecution. The Canadian government, who preaches human rights to other countries, has been the primary agent in violating the rights of its own citizens. To start with, the country came into existence as a direct result of the most brutal genocide in human history. To this day, many indigenous peoples are still languishing on Indian reserves. During the Second World War, thousands of Japanese Canadians became prisoners at the hand of the Canadian authorities. You are wrong if you think it is only racialized people who have such horrible experiences. White skin is not always a guaranteed protection against discrimination. Around the First World War, about 8,000 Ukrainian Canadians were detained in concentration camps. In the late 18th century, approximately 11,000 Acadians were deported from the Canadian soil, where they had been settled for over 100 years. I wish the history of our nation was written differently. However, it is up to us to write a new chapter with peace, love, justice, and equality. An injury to one is an injury to all. China Solidarity Committee declares solidarity with the Chinese community and with all the oppressed peoples, the marginalized and the vulnerable of all nationalities. We will not allow history to repeat. We will not allow injustice to be imposed on any one of our Canadian citizens. We urge the Canadian government stop meddling in the internal affairs of other countries by using human rights as a pretext. Instead, they should first and foremost address human rights issues at home, because human rights of Canadians matter. At the end of his documentary, Moving the Mountain, Mr. William Dere tells the Chinese story of an old man who was determined to move a mountain. Today, on behalf of China Solidarity Committee, I would like to make a solemn promise. Mr. Dere, we are here to move that mountain together with you and your families. Let us unite together to move the mountain of racism, which has been separating us for far too long. Only by doing so can we make the true North truly strong and free. My dear audience, if any one of you would like to become a dedicated, brave mountain mover, please contact me by email at helen_lee100@hotmail.com. That is Helen, my first name, the my last name 100@hotmail.com. Thank you very much for attending the event. Have a good night. Merci. Au revoir.
Bravo.